The 2024 U.S. presidential election takes place precisely 1 week from today, that is on November 5th, and it's looking to be a close contest, with the latest poll showing that the race is too close for comfort for all involved. We have details on this edition of Press Perspective. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective, our daily panel session with members of the press as well as pundits on occasion regarding issues of interest largely pertaining to South Korea and its neighbors. It's Tuesday, October 29th here in South Korea, and I'm Sunhee. Today we address the broader consequences of the U.S. presidential election for its partners, including South Korea. For more, I have Kelly Cho for the Washington Post, that is. Kelly, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
I also have Fabian Kretschmer for German press agency. Fabian, it's a pleasure.
Hello, happy to be here.
Kelly, we will start with you. Let's begin with some details about the results of the most recent presidential polls. Who appears to be leading the race?
Well, it really depends on which poll you're looking at. We at the Washington Post do a daily analysis of about 70 national polls. If you look at the individual polls, it'll go for either Harris or Trump, sometimes with only a 1% difference. So that's how close we're talking here. Our analysis of all 70 suggests that Harris is currently in the lead, with the caveat that polling data doesn't always actually match public sentiment, and it is so close that you can't really use that as a predictor right now. She's ahead in 4 out of 7 battleground states as of today, but again, it's fluctuated so much that it's really hard to say.
Right. You mentioned the battleground states, and Kelly, in coverage of the U.S. presidential election, we often hear the phrase swing state, battleground states. For the sake of our viewers here in this part of the world, could you tell us what swing states or battleground states are? Which are these 7 states, such states that is, this time around, and why are they so important?
Okay, so this is a bit complicated, and even for Americans, it can be really confusing. So we don't go by the popular vote in the United States. We go by electoral votes and something called the Electoral College. So basically, each candidate is trying to win the number of votes that are allocated to each state. It's a state-by-state race. So if, say in Texas, you get 50.1% of the popular vote, you get all of the electoral votes for that state. So it's kind of like a winner-takes-all situation, state by state. So when we say battleground states or swing states, we're saying states that are really on the edge and could go for either candidate. Pennsylvania, for example, in the last 2 elections went to one candidate by a 1 percentage point difference. So you're talking about a huge number of votes that could, win the presidency for someone. And we've seen in the past that even if you get the popular vote, you don't necessarily win the presidential election. As for the 7 swing states we have right now, it's Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. That's why you see a lot of attention from both candidates in those states.
Right. Fabian, now, understandably, not a lot has been shared about the foreign policies of these 2 presidential nominees because their priority, of course, are in domestic matters. But based on what has been shared thus far, which incoming administration do you believe might be a better option for South Korea, and why?
Yeah, actually, I find it quite sad that during the campaign, many issues were discussed, but foreign policy really not so prominently. But I would say I can give a recommendation because I remember still the Trump's first presidency very well. I used to live in South Korea at the time and also used to report about it. And that you could really see what a wild card Trump was. You didn't know what you could get. For example, in the first year, the tensions were very high between North and South Korea, and he was, in my opinion, actively also escalating with a very aggressive rhetoric. Then the next year, there were even summits with Trump and Kim Jong-un, and then the negotiations between US and North Korea really fell apart spectacularly. So it was really from one extreme to the other. So right now, I would say, from a South Korean perspective, I would appreciate predictability. I would also want a president who would support the liberal order, who would support NATO, who would support the alliance between US and South Korea. And in that regard, I would say Kamala Harris is the better incoming president. And I mean, from Trump, we could also see that he made outlandish remarks regarding the security architecture here. He wants to push South Korea to pay more for the security, even said a quote where he compared South Korea to a money machine. I think that was really, disrespectful.
What about for Europe, Fabian? Which administration do you suppose would serve better for Europe's interests?
So Europe has realized in the last years that we need a strong US also as a partner. Right now there are many crises in the world, many conflicts, and Biden, for example, has done a good job in supporting Ukraine against Russia. I think that would be one concern, that the US will continue its support towards Ukraine. In that regard, I must say Harris is definitely better, because Trump has threatened to completely cut off the funding for Ukraine. That is really quite dangerous. And the second big issue would be Europe wants free trade. And in that regard, both candidates would not be perfect. They want to introduce tariffs, but at least according to Trump's plans, he wants to give 20% tariffs on everything. That would be a catastrophe for many countries, especially Germany, which is depending on its exports. So in that regard, also Harris would be better. And for many young people, actually the biggest topic globally is the climate change. They're very concerned about environmental policy. And in that regard, the clear winner would be also Harris, because Trump really doesn't care about renewable energy, etc. So I think you know my recommendation.
Right. Kelly, speaking as a journalist stationed here in South Korea, what are the implications of the US election results perhaps on regional stability here, especially with tensions on the Korean Peninsula as well as, of course, those surrounding Taiwan?
I mean, certainly Harris might surprise us if elected, but I think this is really a race between the status quo and an individual who seems to want to shake up the status quo or maybe even sow some chaos. When you look at Harris and what she said about the Korean Peninsula or foreign policy in this region, it's honestly not that much, and I think that's an indicator that she would probably be very much in line with Biden, who has been very much in line with Obama on these issues. This is kind of the standard US playbook in terms of backing up South Korean security, not really engaging in too much dialogue with the North without some concessions made ahead of time. Whereas Trump has actually shown a very different record during his presidency, as Fabian mentioned, with creating a little bit of tension. I remember the days of fire and fury, I think back in 2017, when people were really worried. Even here in Korea, I know some people were making plans for what felt like a faraway fear of war, but still, just to hear people speaking about it really seriously at that time, it was something that still sticks with me. And I think, Trump, when it has come to Korean issues, has kind of had this playbook of creating tension and then coming in to fix said tension that has been created by his own bluster. So we saw that a little bit with North Korea, where he then came in, as Fabian mentioned, and had these summits. That was something that was very unprecedented at the time. With South Korea and the free trade agreement, we saw that he renegotiated it, and it, in essence, was almost exactly the same, but it came off as if he was, creating a better deal for Americans. And so I think in terms of stability with Harris, there's not a lot of information there. I mean, quite frankly, the U.S. is dealing with such severe domestic issues that the average American voter is not really that concerned with North or South Korea and what her foreign policy may be. And with Trump, I think he's shown very populist and protectionist rhetoric, talking about a 20% universal tariff on major trade partners, talking about renegotiating the trade agreement again. And, I think he's made some comments about Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, recently, and it's clear that it would be advantageous to ratchet up those tensions a little bit.
Right, and speaking about Trump, Fabian, precisely, I believe, a week ago, U.S. magazine The Atlantic published an interview with former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly under the Trump administration, who claimed that Mr. Trump had once asserted to him that he needed, and I quote, the kind of generals that Hitler had. Now, Team Trump, that is, has since dismissed these remarks, denied them, that is. How do you respond?
Well, so I cannot verify or falsify if he indeed said that, but if it has happened, then I think it's outlandish. It's really, it makes you angry and wonder what was going on in his mind that he said those things. But I mean, to me, it sounds credible because Trump has shown for several occasions a huge obsession with dictators, with authoritarian figures, and so I really wouldn't be too surprised if he did say that. I can only say that I'm happy that really the fundamentals of the US democracy have been resilient, and that even a person like Trump, who's clearly anti-democratic in some ways, that he could not change those institutions. So I really trust in the US democracy and hope that a person like Trump, who sometimes really says very dangerous things, if you are if you believe in democracy, then I think this is really not acceptable.
Right. Kelly, generally speaking, Mr. Trump's controversial comments, including the one about needing to have generals that Hitler had, such comments do not appear to have dissuaded the American voters from standing behind him. How do you care to explain this reality?
This is a tough one. I mean, there are books about this. This is the subject of a lot of philosophical debate. Political scientists have dedicated a significant amount of their career at this point to this question. I think it's a few things. One, the United States, maybe a little bit like South Korea, is so politically polarized at this moment that depending on which side of the political spectrum you stand, you may feel that your candidate, whether it be Harris or Trump, represents your core values, and therefore it's hard to be swayed one way or another. I think this race has come to represent a situation in which Harris stands for things like abortion's rights, women's choice, gun control, and Trump's side has come to represent, for some people, Christian values, Second Amendment rights. And so when you have something where both candidates are representing such big, deep moral issues for people, if you stand on one end of the spectrum, some curt remarks or even misogynist or racist remarks are not necessarily going to sway you, maybe, or maybe they're going to fuel your rage at that candidate. So it's tough. So I think, politically speaking, they represent such different sides of the spectrum that it's hard to move people more towards the center. I also think we live in a world of misinformation right now, where people are, hearing what they want to hear on their own social media echo chambers. There's been a lot of research about this. People don't trust traditional media as much as they used to. And so even if someone who, say, is voting for Trump or Harris is presented with facts that have been confirmed by journalists that maybe don't represent their values, they may not trust what they're being told. And so, I mean, all you have to do is really look at Fox News versus MSNBC, and you can see how different the information landscape is there. So why are voters or supporters of Trump not being swayed by things that he says? They might agree with the things that he says. They might believe that the media narrative that's being crafted around what he says is meant to hurt him and is manipulative. They might feel like they don't like what he says, but he represents values that are really resonating with their core, that are so different from values on the left that they just simply can't imagine a situation where they vote for the left, and vice versa. So I compare it to South Korea because I do think that South Korea is in a little bit of a similar point. Politically, the countries are very different, but you're dealing with a situation where the left and the right are just so far apart, and moderates these days are not as common.
Right. Fabian, do you suppose the Trump administration may serve to perhaps encourage cooperation within countries and among governments as they seek to perhaps set up some kind of unity against Mr. Trump's foreign policy tendencies?
I don't think it works like this. I mean, the US is so important that you just have to deal with the reality. So even if Trump is not your preferred candidate, I mean, you get used to it, you do the best out of it. And the general trend that other countries collaborate with each other, democracies who share similar values, for example, my hometown Germany and South Korea, that's a trend that will happen anyway, and that is already happening, no matter if Harris or Trump will be the president. And when you mention it, for example, when I talk to European diplomats here in Seoul or in Beijing, and I ask them why, for example, Germany does not get even closer with the US, I think one reason why countries like Germany are a little bit cautious is because they know soon Trump could be in the White House, and he's not seen as the most reliable partner. So we have to keep all doors open, so to speak. So of course, this has an effect on the foreign policy, whether Trump or Harris will be there. But I think in general, we see this trend that there's a bloc building, almost similar to the Cold War, that you have authoritarian regimes on one side collaborating closer, and then you have democracies who are also getting closer together.
Right. Kelly, the US presidential election, as we spoke earlier, it's too close for comfort for both the Democrats and the Republicans. That being said, what do you suppose are the risks of perhaps another storming of the US Capitol, similar to the one we witnessed back in 2021 when Trump supporters were upset, to say the least, about Mr. Trump's defeat?
Well, first of all, what happened in January 6th, the Capitol riots, was truly unprecedented in a lot of ways in American history. I would imagine that someday my children might read about it in a history textbook in high school or something like that. So it's hard to say whether or not something of that magnitude would happen again. I mean, on a literal level, I'm sure there will be heightened security and that this has set a new precedent for what we might be able to expect. I think that, there's been overwhelming evidence to suggest that, the election was not rigged in 2020. There's no proof that it was, but there are still people that believe that, again, because we talked about things like misinformation, distrust in establishment media or mainstream media, echo chambers on social media. And so whether or not people are going to amass and storm the Capitol if Trump is not elected or if he is elected, I don't know. I do think that we sit in a very different place than we did in 2020. For instance, I mean, there's been several people who have been arrested, tried, and convicted at this point for their involvement in the Capitol riots. Trump himself has been mired in very serious legal trouble because of this. So we know that this is possible, but there's also very serious, heavy legal consequence. There's even been people who have recanted their support of the president now that they've been, or the former president, Trump, now that they've been in legal trouble. It's hard to say if they anticipated something like that happening to them. I think there's probably going to be more wariness from people who might be thinking about acting this way. At the same time, though, people might be more passionate and double down on what they believe in. I really don't know. It's impossible to forecast. I do think that what happened set a new precedent for what we can prepare for in an election, and this is why it was such a big deal in the United States, because we've never really had a situation in modern times where we've thought about, the Capitol being overthrown by rioters before.
Right. Then against the backdrop of this cloud of uncertainty as we wait for the result of the US presidential election next week, Fabian, what would be some of the diplomatic priorities for the incoming administration, especially keeping in mind the current climate of geopolitical tensions?
Well, that's clear to answer. I think China is really the big story that is the issue that the US has focused all its attention. I mean, already under Obama, the US has shifted or pivoted from Europe to the Indo-Pacific region. And China is the world power which can challenge the position of the US. It has huge implications. Also, China is a world power that threatens to use a military force against Taiwan, possibly. So in case a conflict would happen there, that would be catastrophic. It would be an economic Armageddon, and because the trade route is very important. The whole international order has a great interest that there is a stability, and that also the US and China manage their consequences manage their differences in a really orderly way, and will not escalate into an open conflict. And then, of course, there are other issues like Ukraine, Middle East, and of course Korea. I think from the Korean perspective, it's really important not to be forgotten, to still get a lot of attention by the US, because after all, the US will deliver security and, if it's done in a good way, also stability here on the Korean Peninsula.
Right, especially amid speculation of a potential 7th nuclear test by North Korea right after the US election. All right, Fabian, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Kelly, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, the US election takes place on November 5th, and following its result, we'll delve into the diplomatic and trade policies of the incoming administration in our panel sessions next week. In the meantime, tomorrow we have Hallyu Highlights.